two CFR. And when the circulars were there, there was a lot more instructions and how to do things. With the two CFR, it's given a lot more latitude, which is great to a certain degree, but then it doesn't give you the comfort, oh, well, we need to do this because that's how the old circulars used to do. It really talks more about internal control and your organization making those policies and procedures to ensure that your time and effort's okay. And then Roger's going to be talking about all of that at this point. Are we up to just about everybody?
You have 73 now, Mark. Okay. So I think y'all are good
okay.
to start. Yeah,
we're good. So Crystal, you can take over. Crystal is our specialist with the communications and everything. So she's our guru. So I'll let her talk about the housekeeping and everything of what we need to do.
So welcome, y'all. I'm Crystal Garcia. I'm the content coordinator here at TASA. I'm going to be helping with a lot of tech support today. Mark has pre-emailed y'all a handout for today's session that does go to quite a few people. So many times the emails kind of filter those out. So if you did not get that, you want to do a quick search for Mark. It's sent directly from him with the attachment, or you can send me a direct message or a direct email. I'll put my email in the chat box and we can get y'all the handout for today's session. We do just want to remind y'all that we are recording this and this will be uploaded for our TASA's YouTube page. You will get information. Mark is going to email that out to y'all, but a lot of people want to be mindful of cameras, keeping our microphones muted. If you want to interact with Roger and Mark today, definitely feel free to do so. But as a reminder, any private questions that you want to ask, please get those to them, or anything that you don't want on YouTube. We will make sure to get those asked privately. And then, of course, if you're not comfortable with your camera being on YouTube, because those do show on the side of the screen during today's session, please make sure that you take a moment to turn those off. And I think that is it for housekeeping. Oh, one last part. We do have a training survey that we need y'all to fill out. I will be posting that link periodically to the chat box, and then it will, when it closes out, that screen should pop up for y'all. So I'm seeing quite a few people already in the direct messages letting me know they have not received those handouts. As soon as Mark and Roger get going, I will start emailing those out to y'all. So y'all have a great webinar. It's always so helpful and useful when Mark and Roger do this. So y'all have a great day.
So as we get started, Roger's going to present the time and effort report. I will be monitoring the chat box. So if you have any questions, please put it in the chat box. And then I will every now and then prompt Roger if he wants to stop at that point to answer some questions. If not, we will go to the very end and then try to answer all the questions in a Q&A. Typically, we try to have at least 15 minutes available for Q&A, but in this case, with time and effort, it may take greater than that, depending on all the questions. So Roger's here. He's our nonprofit compliance auditor. He comes from Texas Education Agency, where he and I worked together. He became the director of the federal audit section and had quite a few staff people that were there. And he has 20 or more years of experience in this process. So I'll let Roger start and I'll just sit back. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. Thank you for the kind words. I'm so fortunate that you and Crystal are joining me on this presentation. So feel free to jump in anytime. I know you have a lot of experience working directly with these funders and have a wealth of knowledge about the historical knowledge about how these things have evolved throughout the years. So I would appreciate any assistance you can give it to us during this presentation. Folks, welcome again. Thank you for joining us for the time and effort reporting. As Mark suggested, this will be basically all about the payroll cost that's related to the time and effort. Mark already introduced me, but my name is Roger Hingorani. I am a recently, I've been about more than a year now with TASA, but before that, I worked for several state and federal agencies, specifically working with the federal funds. So let's dive into our presentations. Here's our agenda. I want to kind of break it down, the whole thing about why we have to do the time and effort, what's required. So mainly we'll talk about why is time and effort required, who's required to keep the time and effort, how is it reported, what are the internal controls or policies and procedures that the grantee should have in order to comply with the overall time and effort requirements. The whole time and effort is based on single versus multiple cost objectives, basically cost objectives. So we will be talking a lot about it. At this point, I don't want you to kind of think too much about the word cost into these objectives. We'll go specifically into what it entails. And based on those objectives, you have to report the time and effort. So we will be going into different types of reportings that's required based on these cost objectives. We'll also discuss what problems we normally see with reporting of time and effort, all the findings, because it is, Mark suggested, almost 85 to 90% of the cost is associated with payroll cost or personnel cost. A lot of the auditors do look at that more closely. So basically time plus effort really means a lot of money here. So we have to pay a lot of attention to this type of a cost when we are dealing with the total budget for the grant. So before I dive into time and effort, these are the basic rules and laws based for the expenditure of any grant funds, whether it's payroll cost or non-payroll costs. So number one, it has to be necessary, reasonable, and allocable. The word allocable, you will hear that a lot throughout my presentation. Because federal funds are supplemental funds, a lot of time it comes down to allocation of the cost, whether it's a payroll cost or a non-payroll cost, but specifically payroll costs. When you are split funded employees, then it becomes an issue is how do you allocate that cost to the federal fund? It also needs to comply with the cost principles and the federal award. Basically, we are talking about here a Code of Federal Regulation 2 CFR 200, which is kind of the guiding principles behind the time and effort, and also some of the requirements that are pertaining to the specific federal award. The expenditure of grant funds need to be consistent with the policies and procedures applying uniformly to federal and non-federal activities and costs. So basically what they're trying to say is you can't make different rules for different grants and different funding sources. It has to be your fiscal policies and procedures should be across the board same for all the funding sources. It should be adequately documented. Number one thing with any accounting or expenses, the documentation. If you don't have the documentation, it didn't happen. So we highly, highly recommend or encourage folks to make sure that you have all types of documentation, whatever documentation is required to support that expense, that you maintain it. And of course, the last thing, it has to be incurred within the approved budget period. Everything within the contract or the budget period, you cannot, whatever the time period is that, it has to be spent during that budget period. So why is time and effort required? As I just mentioned to you, because most of the time these federal funds are supplemental funds or they are used in conjunction with other grants, the federal government is trying to establish that whenever the time and effort, whenever the work is being done, that it is appropriately allocated on allowable cost activities. And they want to ensure that the federal program paid only for the proportionate share of the personnel cost. If you have an employee who's split funded 4 hours, then they want to know what day did that 4 hours they worked and what activities they carried out for that particular grant. We'll talk a little bit about how do we maintain these time and effort documentation, and what are some of the variables or acceptance from different agencies later on in our presentation. So basically, there are two components of time and effort. One is basically time, noting down the time or the duration for which the work is performed. And the second part is they want to know during that time what activities were incurred to perform or were performed to accomplish the task or achieve the program goals. So why are we required to report the time and effort? And I say we because I am also paid from the federal funds. So even I am required to maintain time and effort records. And if we are audited, then I'm also required to present all of the time and effort records that I maintain to our auditors. But mainly the reason we have to do, all the grantees, including us, we have to do this because of the contract for the service agreement and the contract provisions, which are basically require grantees to comply with 2 Code of Federal Regulation, CFR Part 200, Uniform Administrative Requirements, Cost Principles, and Audit Requirements for Federal Awards. Anytime you have any federal funds, you are required to comply with the Code of Federal Regulations pertaining to Part 200. Before a couple of years, there were separate regulations one for nonprofit, one for other agencies. But since the last couple of years, everything has been consolidated. And now we have just this one regulations or federal CFR that we call it. And that pretty much governs all of the federal expenditures or the cost that is charged to the federal grants. We also look at your local policies and procedures. The local policies and procedures require you to outline what time and effort documentations you are using, so that way, if they are in your local policies and procedures, well, then we will basically follow those policies and procedures to make sure that you actually apply those policies and procedures. And sometimes we will also give you a non-regulatory guidance, and that is pertaining to a particular grant or how they want the documentation to be maintained. So what are the standards for documentation of personnel expenses? And this is directly out of the 200 CFR 200, 200.430. It talks about the time and effort. All the time and effort record must be supported by a system of internal controls which provides a reasonable assurance that charges are accurate, allowable, and allocable. We see that word allocable again. They want to make sure that everything what you're charging to the grant has to be allowable and allocable. It should be part of your official records. You should have the time and effort in your policies and procedures. Your records should reflect, the time reported or the payroll costs associated with it. It should reasonably reflect the total activity for the employees compensated. If you are working 40 hours and if you have 20 hours working for the federal, we don't want you to do time and effort just for those 20 hours. They want you to do a time and effort for full 40 hours. That way you can show that out of the full, whatever the 100% work you did, 50% work was done for the grant-related activities. And as the next sentence says, it should encompass all the activities, whether it's federal or non-federal. It should comply with the established policies and procedures, policies and practices, and support the distribution among specific activities or cost objective. Once again, we will talk a little bit more about cost objective because that seems to be the one thing where a lot of the non-accounting people think about the cost and they assume that there's some kind of a dollar amount associated with it, but that's not the case here, and we'll talk a little bit more about these objectives. So who's required to keep the time and effort? Well, basically any employee who's paid in full or part from the federal funds, not your contractors. If these are only the people that you are going to issue a W-2, or you're taking out FICA, or you're taking out any payroll taxes. Anyone who's really on the payroll, if they are paid, whether they're whole or part with any type of federal funds, then they are required to maintain time and effort. Again, if they are paid in any combination of federal award and other federal, state, or local funding sources, they are required to maintain the time and effort. Anytime if there is a cost that is required to be matched, those folks are also required to maintain time and effort. We don't have that with most of our grantees. We don't have the cost sharing or matching requirements, so that really doesn't apply here. But for the law itself, if there is a cost sharing or matching, they want to see the full details about the time and effort regarding that cost as well. It includes all your full and part-time employees and any federal incentives, such as, we see a lot of incentives or health incentives that are part of the payroll costs, that are considered compensation expenses. Those should also be reflected in the time and effort records. Any questions so far?
Okay. We're doing great.
Wonderful.
No questions, yeah.
Thank you. So how's time and effort reported? So basically, time and effort reporting is a system that is used by a grantee or an organization to document the work of its employees and allocate their work to various funding sources. The way it says, basically, if you have 5 employees, they are split funded, they are working on different grants, you need to have a process in place where you can show that those employees who were funded from those grants actually worked on those the activities that were eligible under those funding sources. So you have to identify your employees, the time they work, and the activities they worked on these separate funding sources. The documentation must reflect the actual time spent by the employee on activities of the federal programs being charged. You cannot do this in advance. You can have your budget estimates, and once again, when we are talking about budget estimates, we are talking about a good planning. Before the budget is made, or even right after the budget is made, you should always be looking at it to see, how much the work your employees are going to be doing on those grants, how much funding is available. You cannot just budget employees based on the funding sources. It has to be based on how much of their resources you're going to allocate towards that particular funding sources. You may need 100%, but you may also have, you may have funding limitations, or you may have several employees who you want to be working on the same funding sources. So that's where you split their costs. So basically, you want to make sure that whatever the employees you have working on those funding sources, that they have their activities documented. The documentation must account for all of your employees' time for the period covered, including state and local activities. We talked about this. If the employees working, they want to see 100% of all of their activities, not just the federal portion of it. The documentation must be signed by the employee and/or employee supervisor with the first-hand knowledge of employee's work after the work is performed. Once again, this is an internal control issue. If somebody is not signing or approving, then how do we know that this took place? So basically, we want to see a documentation that is signed either by the employee or someone who has a first-hand knowledge of that person's work. They can sign off on their time and effort records. When 2 CFR 200 came, the whole focus shifted on the internal controls. They became really big on the policies and procedures, internal control processes. And so same thing with the time and effort. They want a detailed policies and procedures with the examples of forms that the grantee is using to report time and effort. When I'm looking at your policies and procedures, I should be able to see what policies and procedures you have outlined in your fiscal manual or your total manual of policies and procedure that tells me this is how we collect the time and effort. This is how it's being reported. So it's a good idea if you don't have it to look at your policies and procedures. And like I said, it is one of the requirement under the 2 CFR 200. It should always be compliant with applicable laws and regulations. When you are designing your policies and procedure forms or regulations, you want to make sure that everything is compatible to the applicable laws and regulation. You should have time and effort documentation that really, goes towards the accuracy of the documentation. So if anybody is looking at them or auditors are looking at it, they should be able to support the salaries that were paid based on those documentation. It should include verifiable documentation prepared and or approved by the person with the first-hand knowledge of the work. Once again, we are talking about somebody certifying these documentation, whether it's the employee who worked or the supervisor with the first-hand knowledge of the work. I've seen many, many times folks have really good policies and procedures. They have really good system going on, but there's a lack of training provided to the staff to maintain those policies and procedures. And this is where a lot of the mistakes happen. And sometimes these mistakes are not caught in time because a lot of the time the folks are paid and then the auditor comes after a year and when they see the actual time and effort records and then start comparing with the payroll, they might find issues with that. So it's a good idea, whatever the time and effort process you have at your organization, to make sure that the staff who is required to maintain these documentation, that you train them accordingly and periodically, kind of provide them if there are any changes in the process. If you are using an electronic time and effort system, then you want to make sure that you have good auditable controls for the electronic system of reporting time and effort. You want to make sure that the person who's entering this time and effort is authorized to do it. Someone who's supervising is also authorized. So you want to make sure that they have, like, no one can just go into their account and start, reporting the time and effort. You should have good auditable controls. So only the folks who are required to enter or approve the time and effort are able to get into the system.
Roger, do you have a moment?
Yes, go ahead.
We have two questions. One, I think I'll handle that because it's about, do we have any policies and procedures as a template that we can provide people? And I'm working on that for our virtual conference so that we'll have some kind of samples at that point. If anybody wants to, before that time, talk to me about kind of issues or best practices for that, you can always contact me by my email that's on there. Then the second one is that if an organization has an HR, can they sign off on the time of the CFO instead of the board? That one I would probably say it's best to first talk to your attorney about that to make sure. I don't see an issue except that an auditor may say, well, if your HR is under your under your CEO, then there might be that kind of conflict. That's why typically you want to see the CEO be signed off by a board member, somebody that's above that step. So it kind of depends. It could be that HR might be outsourced at that point. That might be a thing. But I think the best answer is first talk to your attorney to see what would be the best compliance. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mark. That was a good suggestion. So let's move on to the allocable cost. We talked about how the federal government is big on allocating the cost because, like I said, it sometimes is a supplemental funding or it's working with different funding sources. So they are really, really big on making sure that the cost is allocated. So here's an actual definition that's just from the 2 CFR 200. and that goods and services are chargeable or assignable to the federal award or a cost objective in accordance with the relative benefits received. If it is incurred specifically for the federal award, which is a really simple thing, if you're specifically, allocating all your resources to one federal award, then it is meeting the cost objective. It benefits both the federal award and the other work of non-federal entity, which is the grantee here, and can be distributed in proportion that may be approximated using the reasonable method. So if the employee is split funded, is working on different cost objectives or different grant programs, doing different things, they want to make sure that their time and their activity, which will reflect into their payroll costs, is distributed in a proportion that, is reasonably, that method that you're using is reasonable for you to say, this is how much time this person used on this particular grant. And that way, that's how they got paid for that grant, from that grant. They also want to make sure that it's necessary for the overall operation of the non-federal entity and is assignable in part to the federal award in accordance with the principle in this subpart, which is what the 2 CFR 200. So basically, they want grantees to follow all the rules and regulations pertaining to the time and effort. Again, the cost objective, don't want you to kind of just focus on the cost part. It is basically an accounting term. I will kind of, as we go on, I will explain it to you how it's basically is going to be defined. So the cost objective, basically what it is a function, an organization, subdivision, contract, grant, other activity for which the cost data is needed and for which the costs are incurred. Your ARP grant is a cost objective by itself. Your SASP grant is a cost objective. It's a grant, is basically a function. Now, so basically, if you look at it that way, your one grant is your one cost objective. Now, there may be some times when you are working on a project that both of the grants or two grants that you're getting paid off supporting the same, objective or same activities. In that case, you could say it is still a cost objective. But for this purpose of this presentation, if you can just kind of see one grant, like ARPA is a grant, SA is a grant, and that's a one cost objective. And Mark, jump in any time if you feel like this requires more explanation. But the cost objective is a major function of a non-federal entity, a particular service or a project, and a federal award or an indirect cost activity. So again, we will keep on going on to this cost objective. Hopefully it will make sense. If not, we can go back and work on this.
Yes, cost objectives are kind of a term that is used for more like to specify a specific cost. And sometimes just within one grant, you may have things like counties or others that have multiple layers of cost within that grant, and you can take it into multiple cost objectives. But I'd say 90% of our grantees don't have that kind of situation. So you kind of equate single cost objective to that grant fund.
Very good, Mark. So there are two types of cost objective based on which the time and effort is based on. As Mark just talked about, the single cost objective. The key to determining whether an employee is working on a single cost objective is whether the employee's salary and wages can be supported in full from each of the federal award in which the employee is working, or from a federal award alone if the employee's salary is also paid with non-federal fund. So like Mark said, 90% of the time, if you have somebody who's meeting single cost objective, they are 100% paid out of that grant. They are working 100% on that particular grant. There are some instances where they may not be getting 100% paid out of that grant, but they are also working on all the activities that are eligible under that grant. So, but I think for this presentation, because almost 90 to 95% of our employees kind of fall under the multiple cost objective, if you can just remember that if the employee is 100% paid out of the grant funds, then they are working on a single cost objective, and they are only working on that grant. Multiple cost objectives. This is where almost 95% of our staff members or grantee staff members, because they are split funded. So in this case, if the employee is working on multiple cost objectives or multiple activities that cannot be defined as a single cost objective. If you're split funded for employees, you're paid out of 2 separate grants, you're working on different activities, then basically that's not a single cost objective. As I mentioned, there are different time and effort based on these cost objectives. So for single cost objective, if an employee works solely on a single federal award or a single objective, they're required to maintain periodic certification. And we'll go more in detail about what these certifications are, how do you maintain that. However, in most cases, as most of the employees are split funded or working on multiple cost objectives, if an employee works on a multiple cost objective or activities or cost objectives, they are required to maintain personnel activity report. Now here again, I'm using the word personnel activity report because this term was used in all the CFRs before the 2 CFR 200 came along. However, it's mostly common, like a lot of the agencies are still using this word, but there are different words that are being used. Some are called a time and effort activity report, a grant activity report. But for the purpose of this presentation, I'm going to stick to this word personnel activity report, because what it is basically documenting your time and activity for the particular funding source. So like I said, you may see this term differently from different agencies, but for this presentation, we'll keep the word PAR or personnel activity report. Is that clear, Mark? Are we okay with that?
Yes, we're okay with that. When you think of it as PARs or personal activity reports, that comes from multiple agencies. It doesn't truly come from HHSC or OAG or the governor's office like most of our grants, but they do come from other agencies that you may get a grant with. So we wanted you to get that terminology just so that if it comes up, now you know what PAR is. It's basically the same thing as your timesheets.
So let's talk about the single cost objective. This is the easy part. If someone is really paid 100% out of the grant or is working on a single cost objective, then what they need to do is just prepare a periodic certification that the employee works solely on that program or the cost objective during the particular period. And so these certification must be prepared periodically, preferably at least semi-annually. And but you can maintain every month, and they should be authorized by employee or supervisor, officially having the first-hand knowledge of the work performed by the employee. So either employee can sign it, or it can be signed by the supervisor who has the first-hand knowledge of it. And what's required on these certification? Basically, it needs a statement by employees certifying that they worked on solely on the activities related to a particular federal program or cost objective for a specified period of time. They need to identify which federal program and or a cost objective they worked on. They need to specify the reporting period. If you're doing month to month, then you need to say from January 1st to 31st. If you're doing semi-annually, then you need to mention that. It should be signed and dated by the employee or the supervisor with the first-hand knowledge of the work performed. It should be completed timely after the work is performed. All the time and effort has to be prepared after the work is performed. This is a good example of periodic certification. This shows, how the employees basically, they have the organization name up there. This is done on a semi-annual basis. It identifies a single program or a cost objective. Here's a statement from the employee saying that I did 100% of my work was on this activity. It has the signature of the employee. It has the name of the employee. It also has the signature of the supervisor and is dated. And this certification is after the fact. So this is really simple. This is where we need to have a little bit of discussion, because this is the personnel activity report. This is for the folks who are required to maintain time and effort documentation when they are split funded employees, basically working on multiple cost objective. Once again, I want to remind that personnel activity report itself can be called different types of names, but for this purpose of this presentation, we'll continue with the PAR. If an employee works on multiple activities or cost objectives, a distribution of employees' salary or wages must be supported by a personnel activity report or equivalent documentation. PAR is required if an employee works on more than one federal award, which most of the employees do, a federal award and a non-federal award, including local and state. So what needs to be on these reports? Well, number one, it needs to certify that the employee worked on multiple cost objectives related to, worked on multiple activities related to more than one cost objective for a specified period of time. It needs to reflect the actual work done by the employee with all cost objectives clearly identified. It needs to specify a reporting period covered, which must coincide with one or more of your pay period, because the activities are generally, or the PARs are generally maintained for a month, because in the following month, the payroll cost is supposed to kind of go according to the month that you reported. Now, your accounting has a little bit of leeway in here. You could be, paid based on the estimated budgets, but if they keep a close watch on it, they can go back after 2 or 3 months, because they don't have to really rush back to make sure, oh, you got paid exactly what you reported on your time and effort during that month. They can actually go back after 2 or 3 months and then make sure they can do their budget amendment. If your time and effort is off by 5, 10, 15% based on your budgeted amount, then they can basically do, they can revise the budgets, they can, adjust your time and effort going forward. So that way, the idea is that throughout the year, you will even out, you will make sure that you're pretty close to the time or the amounts that you are budgeted for your time, for your payroll cost from that particular grant. It should be completed at least monthly, because again, this is, if you're noting your time and effort for every day to come up with the percentage at the end of the month, then I think it's a good idea that it should be completed at least monthly after the work is completed. It should account for total activity. We want to make sure that you're not just showing an activity for just the federal funds. We want to see overall all the activities, all the hours that you worked on other non-federal funding sources as well. So here's a regular timesheet. This is not compliant with time and effort. If you submit this as part of your time and effort, it's not going to be, like I said, compliant. Because number one thing, as you can see, this basically has the time, date, the number of hours. It does not allocate your time or based on the funding sources. This is just a simple timesheet. We like to see on time and effort reports, we like to see funding sources, and also most of the time we like to see the activities performed for that particular funding sources. So here's a good example. And like I said, you will see some agencies may not require so much information, but traditionally this is what, the time and effort activity report is used to look, or we would like to see, because it includes a lot of the information that the law requires you to report. Again, some of the agencies may not require you to report so much, but I'm just giving you what this report has it in it on this meets all the requirements. So in this case, you can see this is a personnel activity report for the month of June, 2 weeks. These are all the funding sources that are listed here. The employee basically is on a daily basis is documenting how many hours they work on each funding source. And here's the activities also performed. Now, these activities, I know it can get into, some folks have a lot of activities, but what I would suggest that if you are going to write down your activity, you can basically, kind of put them in a kind of a coding system like, grant management or outreach services or something like that, because we can always see the job description, what the activities you are required to, or what, based on your budget, what the activity that position is supposed to perform. Because every time we have a position budgeted, we also get your job description. So we know that you're required to do these activities for the grant. But here, like I said, if you just put like TAs, like technical assistants, or TR, like training, at least it shows us that these activities were performed specifically for these grants. So if so, at the end of the 2-week period, you will see that they work 51.43% for this grant and then 48.57. So this basically adds up to 100% of their work performed. And that includes their PTO time and everything. So basically the funds, the percentages got divided into these. So when the payroll comes along, next month, basically this is what they should be paid on. And as I mentioned to you earlier, if the accounting, let's say they were actually budgeted 50%, they're just off a little bit percentage here and there. Maybe in the next month, they may have a lower percentage on the other grant. Now, there are some times when you would see like certain months where you have a lot of activity, for a particular grant, if that's some kind of a training going on or something going on. So you may see a spike, so those are the things that where the accountants will have to go and adjust your time and efforts or your budget, your time and effort accordingly. But the idea is that throughout the year that it should balance it out with your payroll costs according to the time and effort. Any questions so far on this one? Mark, do you want to add anything to this?
Yes, I'd like to add on the one that was not in compliant, it had the actual time that people coming in and out. That's not required by the 2 CFR. Organizations do use it for internal controls within their own system, but it's not required. That's why it's a little bit different from this spreadsheet itself. The other part of that is that, as Roger was talking about, there may be differences like we have over here between the 50% and the 48% in that situation. Typically, there's a leeway, and in the 2 CFR, I think it's 5 or 10%. What I would do as an organization is if you consistently are, or if you're off 1 month, you may want to do a 3-month time study analysis, because within 3 months, you will have kind of everything will work its way out in that situation. That's a very good way to help protect yourself when the auditors come in and they're testing just 1 month and they say you're not in compliance because you're under what the grant requires. At that point, you can then use that as a justifiable methodology to say we're still within our kind of grant lines in that situation, or that we may have gone over 1 month, but then it's changed in the other month. Then that's kind of real world situation. When we do get to the timesheets where they're electronic, Roger, we have a couple of questions. So once you get there, I will let you know.
Okay, sounds good. So I'm going to show now the second type of personal activity report. Now, this is basically, as you can see, they have different funding sources, but they also have very kind of a outline of all the activities they perform for this. And once again, they will report the hours at the end of the month or at the end of the pay period. This will add up to the percentages, again based on the number of hours. Now here it's more based on the activity. So they will also show like how many hours you worked on each activity, and it will end up, showing the total hours worked on this grant. So this is more in detail, but I think most of the people just use this nowadays, and like I said, different funding agencies have different requirement, but this basically covers everything, the activity, the hours, the funding source. There are some other activity reports that the folks would accept, and maybe Mark, I think I may have to stop sharing this and then uh, show the other one, or could we just move on and just talk about the governor's office activity report?
Mark, you're on mute.
Thank you for letting me know as I was rambling on. What we'll do is we'll talk about the governor's office. They have one that's, a template for people that are on VOCA grants, which is another sample in that situation. If people would like that, we can send it to you, to everyone, as that. You can actually go on to their website, and when you go into the e-grant system, then you go into forms, and then as the forms, you can go all the way down to time and effort, and that's where you'll see that. There are things that work for them in one sense, but not all agencies use that type of system at the same time or timesheet. Each agency has their own kind of preferences. So, if you're going to do that only and you have other major funders, you may want to discuss that. And you can always discuss it with me at some point. That's what I do for technical assistance.
Yeah, so like I said,
Okay.
that particular one, and I thought, Mark, I included in this presentation, but I see I have another presentation, so I don't want to stop this and go into that. Just to
Correct.
maybe once I'm done, I'll pull it up to show that, But yeah,
Okay.
that's like I said, it doesn't have the activities, it doesn't add up the hours and everything, so you just have to be very careful. And like Mark said, if you're using it and if you are other funding sources, then I would be a little bit more cautious about that, So, all righty. Moving on. So yes, here we are about the electronic reporting of T&E. So once again, whenever you have any electronic system, you are always subject to electronic audit of your system. We used to have that a lot, where we would specifically have basically we call these auditors that do nothing but audit the internal controls of your computers and all that. So basically the idea is that you want to make sure that you have security measures to protect sensitive time and effort data from unauthorized access, such as encryption. You should have good access control and authentication protocols when you are using any time and effort, or if you choose any time and effort software. These are the things that you should be very careful, or ask for these, that do you have all these controls in place? Then only I think you should use the time and effort software. User training is very important when you are dealing with electronic system. I know my boss kept on training me, because you're not just doing the time and effort, you're also learning how to use that time and effort. So provide training to employees on how to use the electronic time and effort system effectively and securely, minimizing the errors and ensuring compliance with local policies and procedures. Now, some time and efforts are literally integrated with your payroll, your finance. So That makes it much, much easier. They pick up the data of what employee has submitted and then goes into their payroll system, you know. That's not possible in a lot of the cases. So, but again, if it is, you know, if you are able to do that, integrate the time and effort system with other relevant system, such as payroll and or accounting software, you can streamline a lot of the process. You can bridge that gap between the reporting of it and the payroll side of it. The risk with that is that somebody really needs to watch that, what's coming in and what's being, because if somebody's not really looking at it, if there are errors in the time and effort, that can basically translate into incorrect payroll costs. So definitely. So what are the questions we have, Mark?
Okay, one of them again goes back to the digital signatures.
Okay.
And in that situation specifically, I think this is more for electronic reporting of timesheets that yes, you can use digital signatures. It's an allowable part of the grants to do that. But what I would suggest that in your system that you have an audit trail of who does approve that, whether it's the employee themselves, that usually has a part where the employee approves it, or in that situation, that's an electronic timesheet with the signature, but it has that internal control of that audit trail for them. Same thing for the supervisor. The supervisor can look at it, and then on that kind of system, it should have a place to just click and say that that supervisors approved it. So when you're looking at different electronic systems that are out there, you want to make sure that those features are in there so that you have the proper internal controls showing who's actually approved it, whether it's the employee or the other the supervisor in that situation. The other thing that was coming up was that there are some timesheets that you can use that can export if you need to. I've seen that happen with on audits where you can have the auditor come and look at your system, and usually they'll kind of audit around the electronic system, but some cases you can actually export that into an Excel spreadsheet or a PDF format. I think PDF is probably better because that way the auditor knows that there hasn't been anything changed from the time that it came out of that system and is a paper copy. So you can always look in that direction. Look for those kind of features if you're planning to do that. I did see something, and yeah, I agree. San Antonio actually has a very good system. They've worked on it for quite some time. I guess it's 6 months to a year, and I don't know what the expense is, but they've done well, and their audits have come back with that kind of that they don't have any issues in that situation. So it's well documented. I think those were the only kind of questions. Let me quickly go back on that. Yeah, I think the question about exporting, is there a form of electronic timesheets acceptable? It can be. Basically, whatever your timesheet, time and effort reports are, they're typically held until an audit comes, so that you just find a way that to show that you've got good controls on your reports and everything. So you can export it if you like, but I would think that the auditor would like to see that. If you export it, you may be able to get the part where it shows where the employee has approved it in a field and then supervisor. If it doesn't, then you may have that, but the auditor may need to still look at your system, and you will need to walk through the system yourself with the auditor kind of looking over your shoulders so that they can see that those systems are correct. Let me see. I think that was the only other question that we had.
Okay.
Oh, we got one over here. We pay less than $400 a month. Anyone can, oh, okay. This is from Audra. So I didn't realize what the cost was on that. That's nice from San Antonio. That appears to be pretty reasonable. $400 a month for a timesheet or electronic timesheet software looks to be. I would think that that's in a very reasonable part. And she's also put her email address there. So anybody that would like to look at that system or talk to her, they have a very good system. We worked with them on that at that time. Any other kind of questions? Oh, here comes another one. Are we close to the end, Roger? Or I think I can hold this off.
Yeah, we can just have a few more slides and then we can go back to the questions.
Okay, I'll hold off on this question until
sounds good.
Till that time.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, so here are some of the problems that reporting time and effort, and these are just the broad, but we do throughout my 25, 30 years of careers dealing with federal funds, I've seen all of them, and basically, these are the things that you need to watch out for to make sure. And the problem with these time and effort findings is if they're not caught in time, your grants are closed, and then somebody comes in and says, you didn't have a time and effort, or you didn't maintain this according to what you were supposed to do, then it really becomes a cost that needs to be returned back. So it's really important that the time and effort is done correctly. So here are some issues. Paying employees based on the budget. Federal grants rules require employees to be reimbursed based upon the actual recorded effort on grants, not merely on budgeted amount. You can't just budget percentage of employees for particular grant and then just keep paying them without actually making them document their work along with their activities. Again, some agencies may just want you to at least write down the funding sources, the number of hours they worked on the funding source, so definitely you can't just budget somebody and then say, you know what, I'm just gonna, they'll just get paid throughout the year. That's just the funding side of it. You also need to report the time and effort for that particular person. And so if maybe it'll come out to the same as it was budgeted, but it needs to be recorded. Developing position descriptions or budget based on funding source. Here we go again. We can't just, well, we have this much funding source, we need to pay this employee based on the funding source. Again, it needs to be based on the actual effort and not the funding source. Not understanding the cost objectives. Sometimes folks are working on multiple cost objectives. They need to really have their effort recorded towards a specific cost objective, not just a specific grant. For example, a single grant may have different cost objective, as Mark was saying. We don't see this a lot. Well, most of the time, everybody's working on a multiple cost objectives. So if they are split funded, so the good idea is to maintain some kind of a time and effort report. Relying on esoteric percentages. This is similar theme to the concept that an employee's time is allocated based on the percentage of the grant funding. For instance, 13.5% to one grant, 27.7% to another grant. You got this funding, and this is the percentage of the funding. Let me just pay employee based on the funding percentages. Just like you would allocate the cost of cost allocation for a rent or something like that. No, that's not how it's. You need to have a really good planning. You need to see what resource should be allocated to meet the intent and purpose of that grant. How much of that resources of that employee can go into that? Maybe you cannot have that employee cannot work 100% because they have other job duties, but that needs to be really looked upon before or throughout the time that employee is getting paid out of federal fund. Using real-time software and exhausting federal dollars prior to the end of the funding source. funding period. Cost charges of federal must be continuously monitored to make sure that they do not exhaust all the dollars before the end of the funding period. If you have a time and effort system where the employees getting paid 50%, but he or she is reporting their time, or the employee is reporting their time, let's see, consistently at 80%, which means that that employee is getting paid 80% of the money from that particular grant. And so instead of, based on your budget, instead of lasting the whole year, that whole budget will be gone soon because, nobody was paying attention to, you are actually paying based on the time and effort they recorded and got paid based on that. But the budget was never adjusted. So you may end up needing more funds to make the payroll from that particular grant. Executing certification prior to the end of the funding period. Certifying of all time needs to occur after the end of the period that is being certified. For example, time for August cannot be certified August 28th. It needs to finish the month. I used to see this a lot, mostly periodic certification. They used to just prepare it at the beginning, once the budgets were prepared and the employees started working. No, it needs to be done after the work is performed because that's what the employee is attesting. I worked on this particular grant, Adopting overly cumbersome system. Any system that is used by the organization should be understood by all employees. Don't make it so difficult so you don't know where to charge their time. 100% means 100%. Total of the time charges must equal to 100% of your time. You cannot charge your time exceeding 100% of your time, even if you work overtime or you're working, you cannot say that you spend 80% of your time on one particular federal project and 40% on the time on privately funded project. I once audited an organization. The person said he was collecting two people's salary, and he said, "Well, I'm working both these jobs, and I'm working 200%." No, that's not how it's supposed to work. You're basically working whatever time you're working is part of the 100%. So it needs to be whatever, even if you're working, 60 hours, 70 hours, or whatever it is. When you're reporting your time and effort, it needs to be total time needs to be, the total percentage needs to come out to 100%. Not appreciating the scope of the False Claims Act. This is in severe cases, when somebody is literally trying to, make, false claims on the time and effort. And basically the law says that that's really not allowed because that will result in a question cost and sometimes even the suspension of the grant. So these are the problems with time and effort that we've seen. Most of the time it's just folks not preparing the time and effort, folks not implementing their own policies and procedures, and just missing and just submitting timesheets for time and effort. So those are pretty much the common findings that we have seen. Sometimes we will see their time and effort would not match, their actual time and effort would not match their budgeted amounts that were, because they've been getting paid based on their budget and their time and effort fluctuated much more than that. We've also seen folks just reporting their budgeted time out. If they are budgeted, whatever the percentage, they're only reporting that budgeted time. So that's also, it should be the actual time spent on the grant. Is job description required to support time and effort? So the job description is important for time and effort because they describe the job duties associated with the activities performed by positions approved in the grant budget. When we were talking about the personnel activity report, I was telling you to just use sometimes the codes to describe the activities like GM or grant management or TR, training, or TA. When we have the job descriptions, we can see, these are the duties that will fall under those, so we could actually see what activities that person actually performs. So it's a good idea to have a good job description that matches or that has the activities that are eligible to be paid by different grants. In certain cases, the job description can be used to support a single cost objective where a person is getting paid out of two funding sources, but wants to do a periodic certification because their job duties are identical or they are eligible under the both grants. Basically, yes. Anytime you have, if your time and effort activity should be aligned with the pay period. The reason is because, you know, because your personnel activity reflects the payroll charge. The longer you go, the more you're distanced away from what you have reported. So it's a good idea always to have your personnel activity report or grant activity report coincide with the pay period, at least on a monthly basis, you know. Are contractors or consultants working on the federal program required to report the time and effort? No, the contractors or contractors and or consultants are paid according to the terms and condition of their respective contract with the grantee. They are not part of your payroll system. You're not issuing W-2 to them. You are not dictating the terms of their employment. And they are typically paid based on their deliverables, such as reports delivered, counseling session carried out, or other agreed upon delivered, specified in the contract, you know. So basically, you know, they have to show that they delivered so and so those deliverables. If they are met, then they are paid according to that. So therefore, the grantee is not required to report time and effort for contractors or consultants. Okay, this is again, are you required to report time and effort if you're only paid with state and local funds? Generally, what the requirements that we are talking about here is a federal requirement. However, you may have other state requirements that require you to do time and effort, you know, but for this particular presentation, if there is a federal, if you're required to report time and effort if any portion of your salary is paid out of the federal funds here. Mark, you want to add anything to this? You're muted, Mark.
When you're talking about state and local, most of the time, especially with the state has its own, which is the UGMS, Uniform Grants Management Standards. And those guidelines are codified from the 2CFR. So in other words, they are put in virtually like the federals are, except it's for state. So in that case, most of the time your state dollars and time and effort should be the same thing, following the same kind of protocols in that situation. Before we get into the last, well, go ahead and do the last timesheet. I saw that pop up. So
yeah, I'm trying to get that again.
Okay.
Give me a second.
If not, okay. If not, I can start with some of the questions for us.
Yeah, go ahead.
We have a couple of good ones.
By the time
we can always.
Yeah, by the time I pull that one.
Okay. One of the things, and I think some people are a little bit, cost objectives are really something that people think about and they say, well, I'm all under this one activity. Well, at the same time, for time and effort, you still need to, if you're not 100% in that grant, you can't do the certification. I'm seeing some questions about whether they only have one grant, but their hours are split into the grant and unrestricted. Well, in that case, that's truly two cost objectives, two fund sources, and it should be shown in that case. So time and effort or PARs are required in that situation. You can't just do a certification because it's not true that, you know, when you do the certification that you're doing 100% of your time on that grant when you're actually doing unrestricted activities, which could still be part of that activities of the other grant, but it's actually you're interpreting or you would be signing off on something that's not truly correct. Is that helpful for people?
I'd say when in doubt, always do the personal activity report, because you don't want to do certification, because it's very hard to go back and jot down your time for throughout the months if you didn't do it contemporaneously. So it's a good idea if you're split funded, you're not sure about it, just maintain the activity report. So Mark, I do have that. If you can see it on your screen, this is from the governor's office that's on their website.
Yes.
And this is something that we've seen, like I said, different funding aids, funders will accept different reports. This one only has the hours listed on there. It doesn't even have the percentages or the activities. But again, like I said, this is another example, and that's between the funders and the federal agencies that fund them, how they can support that too, how they can justify. And that's really, like I said, so.
Yeah, and in this case, with that example, you're putting in the hours in their example, either for VOCA or VAWA or unrestricted funds. And in this type of example, it really doesn't state what kind of activities. And to be in total compliance, you need to have the hours and the activities. I'm making the assumption that here the agency is saying that if you're representing, let's say, 4 hours for VOCA, 2 hours for VAWA, and 2 hours for unrestricted, that those 4 hours are in those type of activities. Most auditors would look at that and say, okay, show me what activities you're doing for that time frame. So, if you're working as a VOCA, you can probably go through that, and their auditors may ask for other additional information in that situation. That's why we like to see both the activities and the hours in there. And again, it gets back down to, like Roger was saying, you could actually use a legend or a document that says, let's say, accompaniment, and you decide to use 2 letters or a number that directs what that activity is, you can put that on your timesheet, a description, and you can shortcut a lot of the activities by defining it, what it is, and then what you're representing is that code for that activity. That seems to work a little better for most of our programs. I have another question for you, Roger.
Yes, sir.
And this one says, can you talk briefly, kind of some examples of restrictions around people hiring contractors versus staff in that situation?
So there is a difference between the staff and the contractors. Basically, the staff is you're hiring them, you're paying them directly with the payroll. You are cutting their taxes, you're paying their taxes, their portion of the FICA. They are basically under your direct, you give them the hours that they work for you. They don't work for the deliverables, So basically you tell them this is your job description. These are the duties you're required to perform for our job. Whereas the contractors basically are independently, you have a contract with them. You have the terms and condition of the contract, which describes, the deliverables that they will give you and what kind of, documentation you expect them to provide you based on each deliverables. So that's the main difference, is that the contractors is works on the deliverables. They have a set amount paid, or and you have they are budgeted out of your contracted and professional services. And whereas the good example would be all of your, say, copier contract or refrigeration contract or something like that, where you have somebody who's basically needs to come and service your equipment, and then they are contracted. They're supposed to come 5 times a year and take care of all that stuff. Whereas the employee basically works, and it's a really good idea to make this distinction, because an employee who's paid as a contractor can, if they feel like they're actually working as an employee but not as a contractor, they can actually go to the IRS and say, you know what, all these years I've been paying tax, I paid my own taxes, even though I worked pretty much according to an employee. And so that can create a problem for the grantee itself, because you definitely don't want to make sure that you definitely want to make sure if you're treating this person as an employee, they're working as an employee, then they are paid as an employee and not as a contractor.
That's a great example, Roger, because I've seen that this typically happens more in for-profits than nonprofits. For-profits will try to skew their liability for payroll taxes. So what they do is they just automatically say that X people are contractors, not our employees, but they truly are employees because they're regulated by the organization. They're told when to come in, what time, and everything else. And what the IRS has done, which they've sued a lot of for-profits on, is that they're suing them for breaching the law in that situation, because what they're trying to do is they're trying to shift the cost of their employees for their payroll taxes to the employee, to that contractor itself, who's actually an employee, so that they don't have to pay payroll taxes on those employees. That's why it's really good when you're working even in a nonprofit that you make sure what people are or what the services are, and whether you're responsible for them and you do all the directions for them, then they're your employees, compared to a contractor, which might be, and it could be two different things. You could have a counselor that you maintain everything for that counselor that's in staff would be an employee, versus a counselor that's contracted out, that they do their own stuff and they get referrals, but they're not managed like a staff person. So that was good there. The other question that we had is flipping on me. Let me move this around a little bit.
Basically, if you're managing that person day to day, you're asking them to do the work based on your requirements rather than somebody based on the terms of the contract, they are your employees.
Yes. Yes. Here's one question that came up, that do we have to follow these guidelines with 100% funding from the OAG, the Office of the Attorney General? You should follow their guidelines. What I would say is that the Attorney General's office, like others, have to follow the 2 CFR, so their guidelines. Now, if they decide to deviate for whatever, like the governor's office on their sample timesheet, it will be on them if they get audited by their federal agencies that do that. But I always kind of practice being more safe than sorry, that if you follow the guidelines in the TCFR, you should be good for any funding agency that does that. Now, the OAG has some state funds, but again, the state regulations are really codified as federal regulations. So I would kind of watch that a little bit closer. We have one that talks about there's a clarification on a person has QuickBooks as their software, and they're able to use the QuickBooks to track the time and everything in their software. I just lost it. Let me find it again. And they're able to then go ahead and export it, similar to the question or the example I had with the electronic timesheet. We've seen that before. As long as all the export information works and it shows some activities in there, you're okay. My experience with the QuickBooks is that sometimes the QuickBooks will take care of the accounting process and give you that information in a spreadsheet, but then you have to come back in from somewhere else like PARS or anything to have the actual activities. So if that person can clarify a little bit more that
And I'm
that
not
also
sure.
happens.
Yeah, I'm not sure, Mark, if the QuickBooks actually has a time and effort module or not,
Yeah.
where
Yeah.
they would actually go in on a day-to-day basis, report hours and time. That's
Yeah.
an additional information we would need. So, I mean, they may be able to
Yeah.
transfer, export that
Yeah.
for the payroll purpose, but we need to know from the front end what was reported. Yeah.
Right.
Hey, Mark.
The only way I could go ahead.
I'm sorry, this is Hector Garcia. I'm the one that posed that question. Can I
Okay.
add a little bit more
Yes,
clarification?
please.
Yes,
Yeah,
please.
so we use obviously QuickTime is the software we use, and it
QuickTime,
does
okay,
it,
not
it does
Oh, okay,
it
I'm
does
sorry.
amazing at
Yeah.
actually tracking the time, but there's not a time activity, or there's not an activity tracking module built in. So just to reduce administrative workloads, what we're thinking is we're extracting the time tracking from QuickTime, right? That's ideal for payroll purposes and then also to report to the grants. But we're going to add a secondary list of total hours worked per employee, and then have them actually add in the activity that they've basically worked against those hours, and have that as a supplemental document. And then there's going to be a third document associated to it, again, to reduce administrative workload, which is going to be the allocations to each individual grant. So what we provide to an auditor would be the time tracking through QuickTime, a secondary sheet, which would be activity tracking by hours and basically by day. And then a third, which would be the allocations spread, right? Because if there's one person allocated to 5 different grants, well, they want to understand the amount of percentages, or the percentages that are being utilized there. And the reason we're breaking it out that way is because that would reduce the administrative workload, or it would technically automate the activity tracking a little bit more than working one manual time card at a time. Would that suffice in this case?
So let me ask you one thing. You are saying that you will, you will have the timesheet, you will allocate the activities, then you will allocate the funding source, or you will allocate the funding sources and then associate those activities with the funding source?
Well, so what we, two things. So the time tracking is a time tracking, but before we actually allocate the activity, we already know what the allocation is to the funding source.
Okay.
Right? That comes off the budget. And
Okay.
so that would be basically an attachment to the time tracking to say this is how we're allocating it. Then after that, we'll have each employee, based on, let's say, a 40-hour work week, define what hours were allocated to which activities. And we're hoping to do that on a monthly basis versus a payroll basis, simply again to reduce the administrative workload. Do you know if that reoccurrence works?
So we can, Mark, maybe you can ask them to provide you a sample once they actually do it, so that
Right.
we can be assured, we can give them an assurance that's exactly, it's meeting the requirements.
Right. The main thing is that, and it would be good to have that kind of example so that we're kind of assuming a couple of different things when you're talking about that. But here's what I would say is, as long as you can have an audit trail for the auditor to show the time and effort reporting that's coming in, or the time reporting, and the activities are in conjunction and it's in an audit trail, you should be okay with that. But to me, I would just say it should be without really looking at it as closely. I wouldn't be able to tell you that, oh, yes, that's compliance. It sounds like you have a defendable process, but until we actually see it, that's something that we could help you with. And you can always send it to me and I can talk to you, look at it and discuss it. But it looks like you have a defendable process. And that's all I can say about that at this point. We'll just see what we can.
We'll send it over. We appreciate it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. We have a couple more questions that come up on here that kind of contractors versus employees in that situation. I know we're running out of time. What we will do, we are going to take a copy of all the questions and we are going to then put it into a Q&A document and send it to everybody. So that way we can answer everyone's questions at this time because we're kind of running out of time for this. We did budget for more than we normally do of an hour and a half to an hour and 45 minutes, but I can see that we've actually exceeded that by a little bit over 15 minutes. So I don't want to keep everybody, but we will provide that information to everyone that's here, and we'll probably send it to the financial listserv so that people that were not able to be here but we'll be looking at the recording, will get the same information that we've given to everyone here at this point. I think that's kind of the best way to do that at this point. So, because we could go on with these kind of questions for about 30 minutes.
Yeah, I would just like to add, like one of the questions that I had come in on, again, I want to talk about a difference between hiring a contractor versus hiring an employee. You know, these are two different things. You're hiring a contractor, you're going through a procurement process, you're hiring a contractor based on their qualification of deliverables, whereas the employee, you're hiring based on the job descriptions that you have. And so that's a big difference between hiring a contractor versus, and they are hired based on a certain term period. Like this is the contractor has to finish this within the 6 months, whereas the employees could be a permanent employee or a temporary employee. So there are certain differences between hiring a contractor versus employing an actual employee, which you would actually go through a hiring process and they have to follow all your local policy. The biggest difference is contractor doesn't have to follow your organization's local policies and procedures. They don't have to do time and effort. They don't have to do, whereas the employee has to follow your actual policies and procedures, and then also has to do time and effort and all the other requirements associated with the grant. The contractor doesn't have to follow the grant requirements. Your employee has to follow all your grant requirements. So those are the other differences. Yeah.
Yeah. And that can be confusing for programs, our local programs, when you're really talking about, let's say, counselors. You may have counselors inside that, like Roger says, you have control of their functions and everything. They have, like Roger said, the policies and procedures. And then you have counselors on the outside where they're receiving maybe your clients as the contract, and they do the deliverables. So kind of looking at that, those two things. Do you have control of that person, or does that person have the control of what they're doing in that situation? And that's really where you start to look at contract versus employees. And we might we'll put that into our Q&A, and I think we might have some definitions that might be helpful. So we'll do that at this point. Again, if you can, go ahead and do our evaluation training. It's always helpful for us to know if we're being effective or not. There's the slide there. I know that Crystal has already sent that out to y'all. We appreciate it. Sorry we can't answer all those questions because I don't want to keep everybody way past their time, but we will answer the questions in a Q&A. We truly anticipate this would be the one where we'll have a pretty good Q&A document to send before. We also did this pre-pandemic, probably even a year or two before the pandemic, and we had several questions. So we're going to look at those again and look at the questions we have here and see if there's anything that was missing from the questions here that might be relevant for people. And we might bring those across too, so that you can get as much information in that situation. Roger, you did a great job. Thank you for doing this kind of work on here.
Yeah.
And thank everyone for just hanging in there after 2 hours.
It's a difficult subject. It's a difficult subject, but it's a necessary subject that, like I said, like Mark said, there's so much of our cost is attributed to the payroll, and then a lot of it has to do with time and effort. So if you have any further questions, do not hesitate. We are always here to assist you with any time and effort questions that or any other questions related to the grant expenditures. Thank you.
Thank you again.